This recording is in chapter 7, Cross-National Corporations and Agreement. There will be part 1 and 2 of this chapter lecture recording. Now, unlike chapter 6, which talked about government interventions and in the trade agreements, how government can interfere in the free flow of goods for the benefit of their own national interest, for their own political interests, etc. Also, the reasons, economic and non-economic motivations and reasons that was given in Chapter 6 for government intervention, and the various ways that government can make it difficult for free flow of goods by erecting trade barriers and also erecting like tariffs and also non-tariffs like customs regulations and so forth. There's all kinds of stuff that governments can do um, without outright saying that we don't, whatever you sell us, whatever you try to sell to us, uh, we don't want it because for making us look bad in the world forum or world stage, or you don't agree with us. So there's as I said before in chapter 6, to some level there should be a disengagement and separation between political process and the economic process, but uh, they have really weaponized trades and utilize trades to move their political agenda and national interest. Now, chapter 7 is interesting because it follows that kind of chapter that I just talked about, but chapter 7 puts a more optimistic spin as well, in that it talks about cross-national corporations and agreements. So we're really talking about things that will promote a free flow of goods and services. Okay, and that's a cooperation among nations and an agreement among nations. Now, this whole regional economic represents relatively a new phenomena in the history of world trade and investment. So it's really in the last several decades this really has picked up about this global trade. Obviously, global trade is being, as we mentioned back in earlier chapters, is being promoted and made possible through technological advances and the greater mobility that is afforded us through airplanes and of course communication through internet and so forth. Now, chapter 7 is going to look at historical perspective and look at the history of how this relatively new, really in the last several decades, this explosion of trade among nations, by first looking at the role of what's called General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It's called GATT. Now, when I was a student, GATT was something that was really looked at. Now, of course, that gives away my age because that was a long time ago. And then GATT was replaced or enhanced by what we call World Trade Organization, WTO. And you hear WTO now as any country that belongs to WTO belongs to, and vast majority country do belong to, if not nearly all belong to WTO. It sets the ground rules for world trade environment to permit different countries to trade with one another. It's sort of a rules and regulations, if you will, sets the parameters and grounds to which they strive for fairness and free flow of goods and services. So World Trade Organization really has become a primarily multilateral forum through which governments within that framework can conclude trade agreements, and just as important, when there are disputes and arguments and conflicts, that there is a dispute resolution through which there's a mechanism in which country can file complaints about other country who are not abiding by the letter and the spirit of WTO. So there is a way to settle disputes as well through there is mechanism exists. So WTO, which we'll talk about a little later in detail, is really the major multilateral forum and framework to which countries do trade. I mean, there was a time when China was not part of WTO, but once they became a part of WTO, the trade really exploded cross borders among other countries as well. Okay, before we get into, so as it was mentioned, World Trade Organization, major body for reciprocal trade negotiation, enforcement of trade agreement. And then let's talk about GATT, which is the predecessor to WTO. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was established in 1947 by 23 nations as a platform to which permitted multilateral agreements, and whose real objective was to abolish barriers to trade, including abolish quotas. Some countries would restrict the free flow of goods by setting a quota, and then you're only allowed so much and no more, and also ways to reduce tariffs as well. The GATT, the predecessor to WTO, GATT, the big thing was that trade without discrimination. That is, the fundamental founding principle of GATT was to trade without discrimination. What that means is that, and they also like to use this term, anybody that belonged to this GATT was most favored nation clause. Okay, that each member nation must open its market equally to every other member nations. Okay, so that was their founding thing, is to equally, whether it's domestic, foreign, equally open up its markets to all other members as well. So you get the sense, again, it's really to promote trade and then to encourage trade fairness. Okay, giving that, and then which was succeeded by World Trade Organization in 1995. Okay, so when I was a student, World Trade Organization, WTO, did not exist. We studied international business and trade under the guise of GATT. But WTO is sort of supersized, turboed GATT, which again was founded in 1995 as a permanent world trade body for again facilitating reciprocal trade negotiations and enforcing trade agreements between and among all nations that are part of WTO. Okay, so not only WTO adapted and used it as a foundation for its principles agreement, which created under GATT, but it further expanded and enhanced it by now not only free flow of goods, but also things like services now fell under WTO, investments, and the next one is big one, the intellectual property. Okay, that's intellectual property has been really a sore point by some of the nations, and have utilized that to take some other countries to WTO as part of their complaint. Sanitary measures, plant health, agricultural, textile, and technical barriers to trade. So it really, foundation of WTO was GATT, this notion in terms of trade, in terms of spirit and letter of the agreement, that there should be as much as possible reduction in barriers and free flow of goods. But WTO enhanced it by adding more. Okay, so what does WTO does? In addition to these, again, in addition to providing mechanism for dispute settlement, WTO represent 97% of value of world trade. Vast majority of of countries around the world belong to WTO. In fact, they have to belong to it if they're gonna promote trade across the board. Now, something that's also contained in WTO is what's called most favored nation. The WTO continued the most favored nation clause of GATT, which says basically any member country should not discriminate against foreign products. In fact, they should give equal to their own national products or national treatment. Now, there are exceptions. So what they're asking is, most favored nation by being a member of WTO, that as much as possible you should treat everybody fair and have them have equal access to your market, vice versa, which is reciprocated. But there are some exceptions, and these are important. One of them is developing countries. It is specifically referring to developing countries. Developing countries' manufactured products have been given preferential treatment over those from industrial countries. So developing countries like China have given preferential treatment over other industrial or more developed countries. Even movements of goods, if you look at the postal rates, if you were to send something from here to China, is much more costly than vice versa. They've really allowed for developing emerging countries, economies, to be able to build up their capabilities. Okay, concessions be granted to members with regional trading alliances such as EU have not been extended to country outside of alliances. Okay, now so one of the things that that is permitted under WTO, and we've seen this as well, is that there are alliances that can be created within the WTO, like the European Union. Okay. Also, the exception to WTO is that countries can raise barriers against other member countries if they feel that the trading is unfair. Okay, so if there are some just cause to retaliate, they permit that under WTA. Now, exceptions can be made in times of war or international tension. What this is suggesting about WTO is that there's a lot of wiggle room here. And the letter and the spirit is there, but there are wiggle rooms for countries to either abuse it or take advantage of some of the wordings that are in here. Okay, I mean, so another thing that was really important in WTO that was mentioned earlier is that dispute settlement under WTO. There is a clear defined mechanism to settle disputes. Countries can and should bring charges of unfair trade practice to WTO panel. And of course, accused countries may appeal if they lose the initial ruling, but WTO rulings are binding. So if an offending country fails to comply with a judgment made by WTO, they have the right to compensate and also engage in countervailing sanctions as well. So in an ideal world, WTO does have a mechanism. If you feel that you are being unfairly treated, this is the mechanism to use. Having said that, but the reality, just like the court systems in America and Canada, but in reality, it takes many, many years to funnel through your case through WTO. It might take several years. So it's the process. Getting to the process take time. Once you're in the process, it takes time to make it through the panel. Of course, if it's the decision is favorable to you, there could be a massive fine against the perpetrator that have to pay up, cough up. Okay, or the countervailing sanctions can be applied until that loss has been incurred by the victim country is satisfied. Some other countries are reluctant to bring particularly their friends to the WTO. They would rather try to work it out among themselves because WTO is a lengthy process and it can be very embarrassing situation if it's ruled against you. A case in, and also there are other retaliatory measures as well. So look, you know, life is much more complicated than what it seems. I'll give you an example. If there was a trade dispute with, say, a large country like China or United States, and you have a small country that feel that they're being unfairly treated, that there are trade barriers that are being erected, and so on, should they bring their grievances to WTO to against a larger partner like United States or China? US and China, if they are angry, will find other ways to make your life difficult. It is what it is. It's not an equal fight. It's like you invent something, and let's say a large company uh, takes your invention. You know you're the one that invented. You know you're in the right. But to wage a fight in the court system against a larger larger foe who's taking advantage of you, it's going to be very, very difficult unless you bring someone partner to you who will also be able to provide resource with you to fight. Okay, so the wealth, the resources, the strength of the company doesn't matter. It's not necessarily a fair fight. And if you, let's say, even among friends and align, even if among friends and strategic aligned partners, if you bring complaint to WTO about them, that might upset that country as well, and your other areas may be affected as well. So it's very difficult to actually, in actuality, to do this. I mean, it's and arrive at a timely manner. Some of the criticism that's been left out have been failing to pay enough attention to labor environmental concerns, undermine global diversity, benefiting rich at expense of the poor. There can be arguments that can be made for these, obviously, for WTO. WTO is not all encompassing. There are things that they have left out, and for obvious reason. Member states that belong to WTO also want to maintain their own national identity, maintain their own national sovereignty. And so there are lines that should not be crossed. And it may be things like labor and environmental concerns. Now, one of the things that when new NAFTA, and I'll call it new NAFTA as opposed to a USA, Mexico, Canada agreement, the post-NAFTA agreement, it isn't just a free trade where they have eliminated or reduced tariffs. It also required at least initial NAFTA required that the Mexicans to create infrastructures that promoted free trade, that they actually have roads and facilities that you can access it. It required labor, employment, wages, and employment conditions to rise to the level so that not all jobs went to Mexico, and then the companies used and abused Mexican workers, paying them very little money, and then taking advantage of lax environmental laws. I mean, there are other sectors like labor and environmental concerns and so forth that are addressed by some other regional agreements to ensure that one country benefits, to ensure one country does not benefit at the expense of the others. Okay, I suppose the undermining global diversity is an argument where we've seen this in Chapter 6 with the trade tariffs. For example, might be, let's say, McDonald's penetrating France. The French have a lot of pride in their food. The French have a lot of pride in their culture. They want to preserve it. They want to preserve not only the national identity, but national, let's say, food. Now, apparently, McDonald's has been widely successful in France, despite a strong French cuisine and strong French cuisine identity. So whether it's a cultural institute environment like the food, movies, the French government has intervened to protect its national interest, its national culture. And so it is possible, if you have too much trade, that the global diversity, the national identity can be trampled on by more efficiently producing companies like McDonald's to satisfy the needs of the consumers. Okay. Benefiting the rich at the expense of the poor. That could be argued that all these people who have jobs, supposedly who have jobs, are not necessarily good jobs. These are low-paying, unskilled workers that rich countries or rich consumers are able to buy product at a much cheaper rate at the expense of people who are not making a living wage, and that's been the argument as well. Okay. Now, regional economic, let's see, the rise of bilateral agreement. Now, bilateral agreements are popularly known as preferential agreements, but I see the more often what is nowadays that is used in the media is called free trade agreements, or FTAs. Okay, I think the most commonly used terminology to talk about this is free trade agreements. But specifically, the bilateral agreements is between two countries. For example, Canada has a free trade agreement with South Korea. Britain has, since the Brexit, they have worked on FTAs, free trade agreements, with a number of other countries because they no longer fall under the umbrella of European unions. Okay, so WTO permits bilateral agreements, free trade agreements between nations, and obviously, and something like free trade agreements would work well for countries where there's a need for each other's product and services. So Canada is extremely, I mean, geographically, Canada is the second largest country in the world, right? If you open up a map, you'll see how huge Canada is. Canada has enormous commodity, enormous resources, whether it's lumber, whether it's oil, whether it's copper, etc. Canada, it's like kind of like Australia. They're both commodity resource rich countries. And then you have countries like Korea and Japan. They don't have any natural resources. The only resource they have is called human resource. Okay. Korea and Japan does not have oil, so every drop of oil and gasoline they need, they have to import it. Okay. They don't much have agricultural sectors. Okay. They can't compete with, say, a beef coming out of Australia and Canada, which is much cheaper because there's more lands, more agricultural lands, and so forth. I mean, really, Japan and Korea has very, very limited natural resources, a human resource. That's why they have become the manufacturer. They have focused on human resource, utilizing human resource. So they bring in raw materials from other countries like Australia and Canada and make something with those raw material and sell it back and provide stuff. So for the free trade agreements to work really efficiently and effectively for the mutual benefit of both, you sort of have to have kind of like a complementary products. Right? So South Koreans and Japanese can sell their automobile in Canada. Canada can turn around and sell their oils to. I'm not sure if that's the case, but lumber is probably more like lumbers and apples and commodity, wheats and stuff like that. Rice to sell it to, and that kind of situation, it works. It's a complementary trade where both countries benefits from each other's differing resources. Now, if you have two countries that essentially produce the same thing, then it becomes more stickier because they want to protect each other's industry. It might be more difficult to work around that. By the way, the bilateral trade agreement, the free trade agreement, can be all kinds of stuff. It doesn't mean that everything has to be free flowing goods. Okay, it could be a completely full-blown FTA, or it could be limited. It could be, let's say there's a free trade agreement between U.S. and South Korea. They may say to the South Koreans, well, we will permit your cars to come into our market, but no trucks coming to our market for next 20 years or something like that, and vice versa. Okay, so the wording of these agreements are really, or if there is a reduction in tariff, it might take 5 years to get the tariffs to be eliminated. There's a phase-in time, phase-in period, and gradual, and that permits their own domestic industries that may be affected by these agreements to make the necessary adjustments to be able to compete once they have access to each other's backyard. Okay, so also bilateral, and then there's a regional economic integrations, and these are really interesting, right? If you look at it, by and large, they're geographically done. It makes sense. I mean, your biggest partner tends to be the nearest neighbor. Okay, I mean, there could be a lot of different things. There may be that brings us to this regional economic integration, and this is integration, by the way. It could be much more than just trade. Example would be European Union. It isn't just about trade, it's also about movement of people, where people can travel within EU without a visa, without a passport, but as long as they're citizen. I'm not sure about the passport, but as long as they can demonstrate they're citizen one of these EU member states, you can free flow from one country to next. So it could be much more than just trade. It could be movement of people. It could be, they could have a centralized parliamentary or government that it could affect labor laws. If you're part of EU, you have to follow the labor law, monetary policy, immigration. Those can be all affected by EU. Okay, so it's much more than just trade agreement involving free flow of goods and services. It could be much more than that. So regional trade agreements involve multiple countries engage in process of economic integrations. Okay, the geographic proximity, as you can see by these regional trade groups, play a significant role. Okay, now obviously they may have been attracted to each other as a regional group, primarily initially based on free trade agreements, where the member states, member nations attempt to reduce and abolish all trade barriers. Also, when we talk about customs unions, in which barriers to trade like tariffs and non-tariff barriers are abolished among the member nations, and common external barriers are levied against non-members. So if you're a member of these regional blocks or regional trade groups, amongst yourself, you trade with each other and do each other fairly. But outside member state, obviously, they also provide common barriers as well. So as I said, the common market or economic integration regional groups, not only free flow of goods, of capital and labor, but it could be harmonizing a lot of stuff, commercial, monetary, fiscal policy, establishing a common currency like the euros for the European Union, and also you can have a supranational political structure to deal with common economic issues and other issues within those member states. Okay, so again, the whole notion is much more than just about trades, although that may have been the initial trigger and the foundation and so forth. Okay. I'm going to stop here for part one, and I will record part two another time.